I am so passionate about Shostakovich's String Quartet No. 8. I'm going to keep my comments to a minimum right now so I can be a little bit more exploratory with my commentary after we get a listen to the actual piece. Luckily enough, we get to listen to the piece twice. So the way that we're doing this is we're going to listen to the piece as a whole, all five movements all together. I'm going to talk about the musical composition, Shostakovich's life, how the two sort of interact with each other, and then listen to the quartet again. I think repeated listenings are really important to understanding music, especially because music, this intangible art form, develops over time. So how are you to understand a piece upon first listening? So just curious, how many of you guys have listened to Shostakovich's String Quartet No. 8 before? Yes. For the rest of you, this is your first time. I remember that moment, and I am envious of you all, for you have not experienced one of the best string quartets of all time. So I want the musicians to introduce themselves, if that's all right, very quickly before you guys begin, and pass the mic around.
Hi everyone, I'm Catherine. I'm from South Korea. I play the violin.
Hi, my name is Christine. I'm originally from Dallas, and I also play the violin.
Hi, I'm Yu Yu. I'm from Taiwan. I don't play the violin. I play the cello.
Hi, I'm Ben. I'm the violist, and I'm from Houston.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you. So these fine musicians are going to work their butts off for about the next 25-ish minutes. Okay, if you haven't silenced your cell phone, now would be a great time to do that. That was amazing, guys. Thank you so much. Oh, gosh. Okay. Wonderful. Now I get to talk a little bit about this amazing work, and I have about, 3 hours of lecture material to deliver you about this whole piece. So I'm going to have to be really picky and choosy about what I talk about. Okay. That being said, I'm probably barely even going to reference my notebook here. Okay. So first off, Shostakovich as a composer, his birth and death dates place him at an interesting point in history. He represents an interesting transition from the late Romantic sort of aesthetic to the distinctly 20th century sort of sound. So the string quartet that we just listened to was written in 1960, and it took him 3 days to compose the work. At this point, 3 days. 3 days. Like, I'll binge watch a Netflix series in 3 days, but I don't know if I can compose a 5-movement string quartet. I should probably interject with the fact that I am indeed a composer. So this piece interests me from a compositional standpoint, first and foremost. But just for a point of comparison, I would say it takes me probably about 9 to 10 sit-down sessions to write, maybe more, to write a piece of this sort of length and magnitude. So the sort of mindset that Shostakovich was in was a certainly interesting one, an artistic frenzy. And it became an interesting point in his life in 1960. This is where I wish I had more time to just talk about Shostakovich in general and his life. But at this point in 1960, I guess I should probably say something. His music was politically was not always politically favored. Stalin ended up going to the premiere performance of his opera Lady Macbeth and did not like it at all. And if something did not meet Stalin's approval, you could bet your career was going to be hurt by it. Any press that had publicized anything that was positive about Lady Macbeth, they were asked to recant all of their statements. And as a result, of course, because he wasn't in Stalin's favor, his career suffered. Now, 1960 rolled around. He actually became a member of the Communist Party, which is an interesting political move. There are 2 different stories here that we can't really follow too far at the moment, because I do want to talk about the meat and potatoes of the actual music that we listen to. But he said he was, Shostakovich said he was blackmailed into being a part of the Communist Party. And in and around this time, the time that the quartet was written, he was said to have spoken to a friend about the idea of committing suicide in and around this piece. In fact, I have a quote from him. He said, "I started thinking that someday I will die. No one is going to," no, this is going to be terrible. Can I hand this to you? Sorry, thank you, as all my technology falls. You can just drop it on just like that, perfect. Nobody is likely to write a work in memory of me, so I had better do it myself. Dark. I don't want to say Shostakovich was having an emo moment there, but maybe just a little bit. So Shostakovich goes and embarks on writing this 5-movement ordeal. All of the movements are played attacca. They segue very naturally one movement right into another. Gosh, I want to talk more about Shostakovich's life in general, but I think I'd probably actually move on to, some ideas about this quartet. So there's a big quotation in this work, which starts off the first movement, which is in a lot of Shostakovich's work. I'm calling this a musical ghost that haunts Shostakovich for a good portion of his life, because this musical quote ends up showing up in a handful and a half of very prominent works of his, including the Cello Concerto, his Symphony Number 10. He wrote 15 symphonies total, just to give you an idea as to his body of work. Symphony number 15, his Piano Sonata number 2, and of course Lady Macbeth. Now, so the first occurrence of this musical quote that I'm going to talk about, it was in his opera Lady Macbeth, which I told you Stalin showed up at and decided not to like very much, which I think is a point of historical relevancy here, which I'll get back to. Because at this time, 1960, when this piece was written, he said he's been blackmailed into joining the Communist Party, a move he doesn't like, so therefore he's going to quote music that he knows Stalin does not appreciate. I love it. He does some things like this all the time in his music, and because of the intangible nature of music, the fact that you can't hold it, it's really hard to pinpoint when someone is doing something subversive, I suppose, in music. Okay, so Lady Macbeth is his opus number 29, which was written in 1934. So he's born in 1909. Tail end of the Romantic era, beginning of the 20th century. So this musical idea haunts him from his 29th opus number to the very end of his life, which I think is interesting that he continues to recall this one musical motive. Okay, so what is it? The musical motive that I'm talking about starts off movement number 1. So it's the way that it's set up is in terms of texture. It's a round, a very fancy sort of imitative polyphony that starts off our first movement. So we get this interesting saturation of our first motivic idea. Can I have it played in each individual instrument, starting with the first violin where it enters? Yeah. Oh, I guess actually it starts in the cello. Sorry. As you guys enter it in the piece of music rather than score order. Sorry. Awesome. So we hear those first 4 notes repeated as a sort of a motivic interest for us. The intervallic content, and so intervals are the distance between one note and the next note, it's saturated with lots of minor seconds. The smallest intervallic distance that we can travel, I suppose, on a piano, the strings, extraordinary instruments as they are, can actually be in spaces in between the half steps, but we won't go into that right now. We hear this half step motive is sort of strung out later on in the first movement. Let's see, the entrance is at rehearsal 2 for violin 1, this sort of running chromatic line that we hear. Okay, so what he does is he takes one of the smaller building blocks of our main melody in the first movement and teases it out, uses it as a direction so starts our chromatic ascent and then descends. So he's taken something that he wants us to pay attention to within the first movement and drawn some attention to it by linking it together within one melodic line. There's also a sort of moment of musical foreshadowing that happens in the piece, which is 5 measures before rehearsal 5, which happens in the first and the second violin parts. Yeah. It's okay, you guys can you guys continue just a little bit more? Sorry. We're gonna hear that a lot in this piece. Good, awesome, very good. So part of the reason why I'm obsessed with this quartet is because there's a high degree of organic unity in the piece of music. And I think that's part of the reason why it's withstood the test of time as well. I kind of liken this to the greatest Iron Chef experiment, where we're dealing with one secret ingredient, and it is all the sort of explorations of that one idea. There is no one who's the composer who's probably the most organically unified. If there was a contest out there, it's a weird prize to win. You are the most organically unified composer. It's Beethoven, I think, absolutely. Beethoven wins. You guys all know his Fifth Symphony. Sha-da-da-da. Very good. Losers. Okay, good. So, I call that the world's best, like, sort of rhetorical question in music, where the question is answered by the question itself. Da 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 da. Well, it's just da 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 da. You know. Anyway, so why do I think Beethoven even matters? Well, I think. I'm sorry, that's a very straight. Of course, Beethoven matters. Beethoven. Someone's going to crawl out from the grave and take me. Okay, so I think Beethoven is relevant to this conversation at this juncture because one of Beethoven's last, or of the pieces that Beethoven left us, the very last pieces are string quartets. Opus 131 starts off with that like really brilliant imitative count. Is that in your rep right now? I see glances. Okay, good. Right. Okay, wonderful. Imitative counterpoint is one of Beethoven's big things. He starts off Opus 131 in a very kind of similar way that he starts off this quartet. Of course, Beethoven was towards the end of his life at that point as well, and Shostakovich, again taking a page from Beethoven's book, decides to, I think, sort of pay homage to him. In any event, back to Shostakovich's work. Movement number 2. I call this movement like the gateway movement. For people who are like, I don't like classical music, I'm like, oh yeah, you haven't heard Shostakovich's String Quartet number 8 and movement number 2. And they're like, what? Yes, it's out of nowhere, we have this like, and I won't sing the whole thing, I promise. I swear a metal band should really do this piece. So there's an opening melody that happens in the first violin, of course, which is foreshadowed in movement number 1, for sure. It's, again, this idea of organic unity, this Iron Chef of a piece. The thing that leads off movement number 2 is very much related to movement number 1. Would you mind playing the, yes, thank you. Never stop. Okay, good. Good, yes. Okay, so what Shostakovich has ended up doing here is like strung out some ideas from movement number 1, and then like, and that chromatic line that I was talking about, he sort of like fused the two together, which I think is, again, coming back to this idea of organic unity, a great idea. In terms of compositional technique, here we have a lot of fragmentation of the melody, so where we take like a section of it and we're using it sort of as building blocks, usually in a repetitive sort of fashion. So this happens 2 measures before rehearsal 14 in the viola and the cello parts. Very good. Sorry. I'm going to have you go to the very end of the movement unless I stop you. So excellent. So we have this this idea of fragmentation, taking little building blocks and sort of usually using that intervallic content of minor seconds and minor thirds to sort of create more material. Again, he's sort of maximizing the amount of music that he can get out of one singular idea. Of course, we have another entrance of imitative polyphony, that really fun, jumbling texture that happens between the first and the second violins at rehearsal 17. Very good. So an entrance that's just, a click or two apart suddenly makes the music sound a lot more alive. So when we listen to music, and again, sort of hopping all around here, we listen to, I guess, 4 to 5 main components at a given time. We're paying attention to instrumentation, the instruments that are playing, the tone colors and the timbres that those instruments are creating. We're paying attention to rhythm and meter and how those two interact, whether or not there's unexpected deviations from the metric pull in a piece, or whether it's falling just in line. We also experience form, how repetition is created in music. Yes? Do you have a question?
I do.
Yes.
I do have a question. My question is, one of the things I'm wondering about is why Shostakovich's music is so potent throughout, since it was written, and especially now. It's because he was living under a dictator. Yes, he was. Stalin. And his friends were disappearing in the middle of the night, and if Stalin didn't like your music, you would be gone. Just like what seems to be on the horizon for us.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
One more thing, which is that he used symbolic messages to express the horror of his situation, and it's in the music. You can hear the horror, the fear, the strain, the stress of his life, and that's what we respond to when we hear this music.
Sure.
You hear the knock, 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 knock. That's the police at your door. You can hear the fluorescent light that wouldn't go out in the prison. That's the E that's held in the cello. The E, the long harmonic E. That's because the prisoners left the fluorescent lights on 24 hours a day. These are symbolic expressions of the political situation. Now, what did Stalin actually want in his musicians? He wanted patriotism. He wanted to sell the Russian story. He wanted to manipulate the audiences with his patriotic music. And as you can see, Shostakovich didn't do that. That's why he was in trouble. He was able to somehow stay out
So,
of the
yeah. I have also a slightly different interpretation of the work. Okay, so regarding the imitative polyphony that I just talked about, the idea of organic unity, yes, okay. The idea of stress and strain and relating it to the instruments of the string quartet. I think the cello of any of the instruments in the string quartet is put under the most strain. Indeed. He does what I call this technique of pushing the ceiling, where he really has the cello up in the most expressive register of the instrument. Let's see, that happens around like rehearsal 33 for you. But at this time in the 20th century, we're dealing with trying to push the envelopes of, or the envelope of all of the different techniques that are capable within each of the instruments, and sort of exploring their own voices. And like I said, I think the cello gets a little the most treatment in that respect. Would you mind playing the passage at 33? Brilliant, thank you. One of the reasons why I call this piece also a gateway quartet is because it uses what I call like what would be power chords for a string ensemble, utilizing the open strings and trying to get as much bang for your buck as you can with the sound. So that definitely happens for the full group starting at like rehearsal 27. Sorry to go a little bit backwards and forwards here, but if you guys could play that as a group, that would be fabulous. Yeah, everyone would be great. Perfect. Perfect. Awesome. Yes, and that's exactly the passage I play for people when they're like, I don't know if I could really get behind a string quartet. I was like, have you really heard everything a string quartet can do? So power chords, these really aggressive playing techniques, which are very, I'm going to say easy for you guys, but are idiomatic to the instrument for the most part, at the very least. Okay, moving on, in terms of talking further about organic unity, Shostakovich makes great use of what we call a metric modulation, or a pivot where we're taking this sort of the heartbeat of one movement and making it the heartbeat of the next. I know there's a big dramatic pause that happens in between movements 2 and 3, but it would be nice to see if we can't sort of feel that metric modulation. If you guys can transition into it, yeah. When we have a pulse in our second movement becomes our new pulse in our third movement, which really makes the two slide very wonderfully one right into another. In the third movement, we have a couple of appearances of some interesting string techniques as well. The Bartok pits makes a popular appearance. Do you guys want to just demonstrate any Bartok pits whatsoever? I think it's most impressive sounding on the cello, personally. Yeah, excellent. It's this weird kind of like rubber band snapping sound. When he combines it with this trill that happens in one of the upper instruments, we have a nice combination of different instrumental colors, which further sort of expands our landscape for the third movement. Very good. The bariolage. I didn't even talk about bariolage, guys. That very cool, fast alternation, as I try to demonstrate it and go out of my mic area, that happens in the second movement. I guess we did sort of, would you like to demonstrate any sort of bariolage? This sort of, any. Exactly. It's one of the most impressive looking things that exists on string instruments, but it's fairly easy. Yes, yeah, sort of. I talk about it like I play an instrument, but I'm an oboist, actually, which is a deep, dark secret. Okay, very good. Let's see. We also have lots of motivic borrowings that happen from elements of movement number 1. We have this opening fugue that happens in movement number 3, which is in the violin, starting at like rehearsal 33 in movement 3. Oh, what? Movement 3? Rehearsal 33, rehearsal 39, unless we're working on different scores. That's okay. 39, yes. Yes, okay, yeah. Wonderful, excellent. So we have this sort of return of our movement number 1 idea. Probably my most favorite section of movement number 3 is the peg-legged aspect of it, where we enter, all of a sudden we have these strange intrusions of simple time within our compound time feel, and the awkward viola is usually the one who, I love it, it's the ooh, ah, ooh, ah, ooh. It's the best line in music history. Can you guys play for us, starting at perhaps, oh shoot, maybe it's on our sheet. Let's see. 42, yes, that'd be great. Yeah. Back to 3. Oh, go ahead. No, sorry. I should have told you I was going to talk over you. Can we do that one more time? I'm just noting that when we go back into our feeling of 3. So we're going to start in simple time, this feeling of 2. Then I'm going to rudely talk over the music. I'm so sorry. Shostakovich. 1 and 2. Good. Okay, awesome. Good. So yes, we have these weird intrusions of simple time within our compound time feeling, which adds to this sort of peg-legged waltz feeling, which you guys gave in your interpretation, which I thought was lovely. I won't put you on the spot, but you use lots of rubato in your third movement. Oh boy. It's good. It reinforces the point that I'm making right now. So it's like we talked about it or something. So rubato, this feeling of pushing and pulling of our tempo or our meter. Shostakovich actually writes it within the movement later on with this feeling of duple or a combination of 2 beat pulses and interjecting it within our more dominant 3 beat pulse that we have. The thing that gets us from movement number 3 to number 4 is again another metric modulation, this idea of pivoting, the smallest possible movement from one section to the next within the music. There's a movement number 1 quotation in the first violin at measure 58 that hopefully we can play. Beautiful, thank you. Of course, at the top of the movement, sorry, I didn't even introduce it, but the knock of death. We need to play the knock of death. Not that we didn't hear it enough, but. Even sounds like knock of death, yes. The knock of death is my favorite. It, of course, makes this very cool intrusion against a pedal point that is held within the fourth and the fifth movements. A pedal point usually helps us sustain an idea of tonality, this idea of a harmonic center of a piece of work. In this case, it happens in the higher part of the register, so it feels like a little bit more of an annoyance than something that actually functions within the music. Whether that is to be a buzzing neon light, Shostakovich never wrote, to my knowledge, that these ideas equal a particular image for him. And what the composer intends is a very important aspect of the piece, or at least I feel. Well, I love people to interpret my work and say, like, it reminds me of this or that. Unless I intend it in the work, it's anyway, it's an important aspect of analyzing any composition. So Shostakovich, having confided in his friend about feelings of suicide, this sort of tip of the hat that he has in the first movement to Beethoven's late string quartets, this motivic idea, this very ominous knocking that occurs at the very end, and this overall structure of this circular form. This idea that we start from our idea, our motive, our melody that's set polyphonically as a very interesting round between all the instrumentalists that then branches off into fragmentation of that idea, exploration of that idea, and then comes back to the sort of singularity of that we had in the first movement, creates this very overarching, what we call an ABA form. Very similar to life, I suppose. A sort of like, sunrise, the day that progresses, and the sunset. So, what is Shostakovich's String Quartet number 8 about? I have no idea, technically. I have some ideas based on some little bits of evidence that he's left with us. But what I do know is that a lot of the ideas that he had here within this piece are within other pieces in his body of work. This musical ghost, this thing that continues to haunt him like a muse that's screaming, just to bring the title of the event. It's like saying the title of the movie, right? So without further, I guess, exploration of the piece, and actually, do we have time to take questions at this point? 2 questions. Who's gonna ask one of the 2 questions? Yeah. Yeah, you can take this.
I really love Shostakovich's music, but I just don't understand why it's not played very often.
I play it all the time. Spotify has gotten in touch with me and be like, you can listen to someone else aside from Shostakovich. I think actually he's a fairly well-performed composer. I hopefully am not the only person who thinks that. Yeah, I think his music is played a fair amount. There's so much music that by dead white dudes that's performed in general. So, but his name definitely makes the list. Sorry, music history. We have a fair unfair gender balance within programming concert music, but I think Shostakovich does get a fair amount of playtime. Yeah.
So a question I have, I don't know if Shostakovich wrote about this during his life or if anyone's postulated on it, but I imagine that during his time, he had a lot of conflicted ideas about nationalism and his relationship to Russian identity. When I hear his music, particularly that dun 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 dun, to me that sounds very Russian. Could you speak a little bit maybe on that?
Absolutely. So one of the big motivic quotations that happens in the Lady Macbeth opera is based on a Russian folk tune, which is the basis of one of the main melodic ideas here. So yeah, I think Shostakovich goes back and forth within incorporating, folk tunes and nationalism. I think he also took a page from Stravinsky's book at that time. Stravinsky was a huge point of interest for Shostakovich, particularly Stravinsky's neoclassical period. I know he had moved past a lot of Russian quotation by that point because it's post Rite of Spring, etc. But I still think that we definitely have that sort of heavily quoted sourcing that happens within, especially his symphonic works. The Symphony No. 7 for sure, Leningrad Symphony, that has a lot of quotations that sort of went back and forth in terms of being in political favor and then not in political favor. Yeah. Yes.
Is there a reason why you didn't mention that the motif is a reference to his name?
It is. Thank you. It is absolutely a reference to his. It's the musical spelling of his name. And there's a bunch of other composers who did that. Everyone is obsessed with putting their names in music. Bach, right? Who else did that? Schumann. Brahms did as well. Right. Oh, okay, good. So that works by that's it. Can we actually give the example in this one? Yeah. So the notes that we have here, D, E flat, C, B. So those relate to pitches that correspond to his name. The actual spelling, though, is E flat is related to what pitch, though? S, that's right. DSCH. Right, H is, oh, right, yes, H is B. Good. So we relate different, so somewhat a backwards system, because H is B flat. How am I even going to start talking about what that even means? It's a way of sort of taking letters from your name and incorporating it into a musical signature. Bach is a little bit, but again, not really, again, with the H being the B flat, it's not as easy. There's a little bit more history there than I can actually speak about, but yes, it's a way of inscribing your musical or your initials into music. I can't do it with my name, unfortunately. There's no W. Yes.
Sorry. You mentioned that you had some theories about the piece. Can you just give us some of those theories? And also, I noticed that the calmest bits of the piece, right at the beginning and right at the end, there's not some change from loud to soft or staccato to smooth. Do you guys, players, have theories about why it becomes really vicious in the middle and it becomes a lot calmer at the end?
I think you need to, okay, so I think this is about Shostakovich's life, more about than to the victims of fascism and war, personally. I think that if you're going to signify your life in a piece of music, it should feel like you've traveled somewhere and you've done something. And I think a high amount of contrast is what you need to do to cover that kind of a landscape. Again, sort of reinforcing this idea that I think it's about Shostakovich, this idea of motivic unity, and this like sort of singularity that is expressed, and we have it going through its greatest points of trials and tribulations within those turbulent second and third movements, and then it kind of reaches a kind of calm, like an acceptance of who and what it is in the fourth and the fifth movement. We have this knock of death, this sort of this annoying pedal point that continues on, but the motive, the original ideas just continues to persist. And it persists until the very end, until it kind of dies away like a fading star. So that's my take on it. I think I have a little bit of proof in my pudding, so to speak, because of the way he has revisited this, or the way he did revisit this music in multiple pieces throughout his life, particularly during times of stress. I didn't even mention, in the 40s and 50s, Shostakovich went through this massive unrequited love situation, and in the 40s and 50s, he revisited this motivic idea that is within the eighth string quartet, again at length. So this thing that he comes back to time and time again, that he explored at length as a sort of almost like a suicide statement, I think, is my personal interpretation of the work. He never wrote me a letter like, "Dear Whitney George, in the future, I hope that you interpret my work as a musical suicide note." So I don't, that's all the proof that I have about my reading of the work, but it's certainly one, and mine at that, yeah. No other questions? I'm off the hook. Okay, good. We get to listen to it one more time, thinking about all of those things. So while listening, think about the original idea that we start off with, how it expresses itself and changes within and transforms within the five movements, how we have this knock of death within the fourth, but this sort of persistence of our original idea that eventually sort of fades to a close. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. I'm thrilled that I got to share some of my thoughts about Shostakovich with you. Enjoy the rest of your Friday evening. Please keep up to speed with what Groupmuse and Think Olio are doing. We're up to no good, and you should always see what we're up to. Thank you.
Thank you.